Brilliant. Great to be together this morning. Thank you, Anna and the team. If you've got a Bible, please open it to Daniel. That's where we're going. The book of Daniel. If you're a visitor this morning, welcome. It's really great to have you with us. I hope you feel at home among us this morning. My name's Rich, part of the team leading the church here. Today we arrive at Daniel chapter 4. And Chris and I are going to share this talk. It doesn't mean you get two talks of 40 minutes, okay? Don't worry. We're watching the clock. Today we arrive at Daniel chapter 4, which is a little bit different in many ways to Daniel chapters 1 and 3. I don't know if anyone's read Daniel chapter 4 in preparation for this week. It's quite a chapter, isn't it? Let's just remind ourselves of where we find ourselves in the book of Daniel. Chapter 1. We get introduced to Daniel, this young 15, 16-year-old, and his three friends, and we get introduced to Nebuchadnezzar, the king of the Babylonians, the king of the Babylonian Empire, who has deported young Jews from Jerusalem to Babylon to be in his court, to be trained by him, and ultimately to work for him. It's the period that we call the exile in biblical history. It's the 70-year period where the Jews are no longer living in Jerusalem. They have to live as exiles, as refugees essentially, in the city and the nation of Babylon. Chapter 1, they pass the first test. Well done, Daniel. They take a stand and pass the first test on a reasonably small thing. Chapter 2, they get another test and they pass it again. Daniel, incredibly brave, goes before the king. He's about to be killed, but he goes before the king and he says, give me a bit of time. And him and his friends pray and they get given an interpretation of Nebuchadnezzar's dream, and all ends well in that chapter. Chapter 3, Daniel was having a holiday or something. He's not there in chapter 3. His three friends are, and they refuse to bow the knee to a statue that Nebuchadnezzar makes. Daniel's obviously the key figure in these opening few chapters, as are his three friends, as is King Nebuchadnezzar. He's the other central character in these opening chapters. After chapter 3, we don't see the three friends anymore. They're only in chapters 1 to 3. After chapter 4, we don't see Nebuchadnezzar again. That's the end of his time with us, so to speak. And he goes on quite a journey in these opening 4 chapters that reach their conclusion today in chapter 4. And if the opening chapters were about taking a stand and Daniel and his friends being brave and not settling, this chapter's a bit different. It's really about the perils of pride, the dangers of walking in pride. Let's read the first 3 verses, and then I'm going to hand straight over to Chris. The first few verses are really about a declaration of the king. Let's read these first few verses. King Nebuchadnezzar, in chapter 4, verse 1, to the peoples, nations, and men of every language who live in all the world, may you prosper greatly. It's my pleasure to tell you about the miraculous signs and wonders that the Most High God has performed for me. How great are his signs! How mighty his wonders! His kingdom is an eternal kingdom. His kingdom endures from generation to generation. Just pause there. Where's that come from? That is King Nebuchadnezzar, like murderous King Nebuchadnezzar, who's set up statues for people to bow to him. That's Nebuchadnezzar saying, how great are the signs of Yahweh, the King of Israel. His kingdom is an eternal kingdom, unlike mine, he understands. His dominion endures from generation to generation. That's the conviction that the king reaches at the end of his life. And he sets it at the beginning of this chapter. He puts the conclusion in the introduction. Okay, this is like a letter to his people, and he puts the conclusion of what's happened at the beginning, which was a custom that was done at that time. He's put the conclusion at the beginning, which seems to be that he's come to some sort of faith, hasn't he, in God? He's declaring the wonders of God. He puts his conclusion, and then the rest of the chapter tells us, how does he reach this conclusion? Is this the same Nebuchadnezzar that we saw before? How on earth did he get this far? That's the declaration of the king. Chris is going to come and help us see a little bit of how we get this far.
It's a bit fun when you get the switch because you get to see the twice putting the Bible and the tablet on the podium for everyone to see. But two men, quite unalike in character, in ancient Babylon, where we lay our scene. From ancient foes breaks new life, where dreams bring new revelation. From forth the meeting of these two men, an emperor is humbled and an empire is changed. As Rich said, that Nebuchadnezzar puts his declaration of faith, the conclusion in the introduction. But to understand how we even got there, you need to read the rest of the chapter. You can't just skip and read the nice bit at the beginning and skip to the end and read the nice bit at the end. You've got to read the meat in the beginning as well. And actually, this is an interesting chapter, I thought, reading it, because to me, maybe this is just me, but it plays out a bit like a play, like something you go and see. There's different acts in the play. We're on Act 4 now. There's different scenes. You can always imagine the stages being put up and then being taken away from the next scene. So, we've got no stage, but let me introduce you to Babylon. This is Babylon. This is the largest empire of the time. It has swallowed the previous largest empire, the Assyrian Empire. And the city itself is huge. It's enormous. Largest city in the world, covering over 2,500 acres, it's believed. Absolutely ginormous. Would have made Jerusalem seem tiny. The Greek historian Herodotus claims that the walls were 80 feet thick, 320 feet high, 56 miles long. Although archaeologists dispute some of this, the truth is it was enormous. 8 fortified gates surround the city. The main gate, the Ishtar gate, controlled the main passageway into it, covered in blue tiles, adorned with lions, dragons, and bulls. This city was made to proclaim the glory of the Babylonian empire, their emperor, and their gods. Over nearly a century ago, the Assyrians had destroyed the city, and the following Babylonian emperors had spent their whole lives trying to rebuild it. And in fact, Nebuchadnezzar seems to have been the one who did the most work on it. 9/10 of the bricks found archaeologically seem to have Nebuchadnezzar's name on it. He was stamping his name all over the city. He seemed to have been huge in building the city back up. Nebuchadnezzar was one of the emperors who helped make Babylon the superpower it was. So, scene 1, we get into the story. Nebuchadnezzar is at home in his palace, content and prosperous. He's in the greatest city there is. He's the guy who built it all up. Of course he's content. Of course he's prosperous. What does he need to do apart from sit around and just enjoy what he's built? But then he has a dream that makes him afraid. He says, as I was lying in bed, the images and visions that passed through my mind terrified me. What could terrify this man? We've seen him terrified, but you think he would have kind of got used to what he's seen in the previous chapters. But what could terrify this man now? So, like in chapter 2, he brings his magicians, his enchanters, his astrologers, all his wise men, the wisest people in the kingdom before him. He tells them the dream. This time it seems he's pretty happy to tell them the dream. He doesn't want them to tell his dream to him and then interpret it. And again, they can't do it. Again, they are humbled themselves when they can't do it. And then he says, finally, Daniel came into my presence. Not Belshazzar, sorry if I said that wrong, but Daniel uses his Hebrew name. Daniel came into my presence and I told him the dream. He is also called Belteshazzar, but it's Daniel came into my presence. And he says to him, Belteshazzar, chief of the magicians, I know that the spirit of the holy gods is in you, and no mystery is too difficult for you. Nebuchadnezzar's on a journey. He's starting to use Daniel's Hebrew name. He recognizes there's something in Daniel, but there's still his polytheistic pagan roots of the spirit of the holy gods is in you. He's not quite there. So what happens next? It brings him to the place of a kind of a faith in God. He tells the dream to Daniel. These are the visions I saw while lying in my bed. I looked, and there before me stood a tree in the middle of the land, and its height was enormous. A tree of cosmic proportions reaching up to the skies. A tree which would have spanned a great distance, maybe representing the Babylonian Empire and its reach, maybe representing Nebuchadnezzar himself. We'll see. Under it, its leaves were beautiful. It's beautiful. Not ugly, not terrifying to look at, beautiful. Its leaves were beautiful. And under it we live all the animals. It provides shelter, it provides shade, and it provides food for all of the animals. This speaks of the far-reaching nature of the tree. And yet, a holy one, a messenger comes down and cuts down the tree. Cuts it down, strips off its branches, says, let the animals scatter, let them run out from it. But leaves a stump, bound with iron and bronze, to remain in the ground. This is when we start to see that this tree isn't just a tree representing a group or a people, but it is representing a person. For they say, let him be drenched with the dew of heaven, and let him live with the animals among the plants of the earth. It's an interesting one, because this is a guy. We know that, so it's talking about a guy being cut down, a guy being disciplined, but this was a beautiful tree. It gave food, it gave shade, it gave shelter. These are good things, right? So why was he disciplined? Again, we've got to read on, going into scene 3. As we come to the end of the dream, going to the next bit. Daniel now has the task of telling Nebuchadnezzar what this all means. The problem with having an absolute monarch in power is if you don't tell them what they want to hear, it's quite possible you're going to lose your head or get punished in some other way. Daniel now has the terrifying task of telling Nebuchadnezzar the dream. It says Daniel was greatly perplexed for a time, and his thoughts terrified him. This man who's stood up to Nebuchadnezzar before, whose friends stood up and said, no, we're not going to bow down to the golden statue. It terrified him right now. But the king just said, don't let the dream or its meaning alarm you. So here's Daniel's task. He answers, my lord, if only the dream applied to your enemies and its meaning to your adversaries. The tree you saw, which grew large and strong, with its top touching the sky, visible to the whole earth, with beautiful leaves and abundant fruit, providing food for all, giving shelter to the wild animals, and having nesting places in its branches for the birds. There are beautiful things here again. I think it's key that we see that this tree was beautiful. There were good things. Nebuchadnezzar is about to be humbled, but there is good things he's done. Not saying everything he's done is good, not by a long shot, but there are good things he has done. He has provided a measure of security for the people in his empire. He's provided them with some food, with shelter, with protection. And these things are being remarked as beautiful. But there is something wrong. Your Majesty, you are that tree. I wonder if we imagine this as like the kind of the play. The king's on his throne, Daniel's before him, and just goes, Your Majesty, you're that tree. Everyone behind him is just like, what did he say that for? Why did he tell the king that he's the one who's going to be cut down? Why did he tell the king that he's the one who's going to be destroyed? The king who wants to establish his kingdom forever, who wants to reign forever. I wonder if they were kind of saying, like, he's going to lose his head. But Daniel just keeps going. You have become great and strong. Your greatness has grown until it reaches the sky. Just like the tree, Nebuchadnezzar is reaching up in cosmic ways, and maybe a bit too far he's trying to reach. And your dominion extends to the distant parts of the earth. It covers the known world. But your Majesty saw a holy one, a messenger. Interestingly, he's actually using language that Nebuchadnezzar himself is using. He's not calling him an angel. He's not saying this is an angel of God. He's just saying this is a holy one. This is a messenger. Language that Nebuchadnezzar would understand. So you saw a messenger coming down from heaven saying, cut down the tree and destroy it, but leave the stump bound with iron and bronze in the grass of the field. While its roots remain in the ground, let him be drenched with the dew of heaven. Let him live with the wild animals until 7 times pass by for him. He's hammering it home, isn't he? He's definitely not pulling it back and just saying, nah, I'll just tell you the nice parts. He is hammering it home. You're that tree. You're the tree that's going to cut down. Yeah, you're going to be cut down. You're going to be forced to be, you're going to be drenched with the dew of heaven. You're going to be with the wild animals, and it's going to be for a time. This is when we get to the point where Daniel's making clear why this is going to happen. This is the decree the Most High has issued against my Lord the King. You'll be driven away from the people and will live with the wild animals. You will eat grass. Can you imagine that? The king of this vast empire, who we know from chapter 1 had amazing food and amazing wine. He had all the best stuff. He'll be eating grass. Like the ox, and you'll be drenched with the dew of heaven. 7 times will pass by for you until you acknowledge that the Most High is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth and gives them to anyone he wishes. See, it seems like the decree is here. Nebuchadnezzar, you haven't got it right. It's not you who's so amazing. Sure, you've built up this empire. You've helped bring it from the ashes of defeat to swallow up the empire that defeated you. But it's not you. It's not you who has the power. It's not you who's given you this authority. There's hope, though. The command to leave the stump of the tree with its roots means that your kingdom will be restored to you when you acknowledge that heaven rules. It seems that Nebuchadnezzar is not just being swatted aside, he's just being disciplined. He's being disciplined that something may come of it. Therefore, your majesty, be pleased to accept my advice. Here's the kicker. This is where it gets really, really dangerous for Daniel. But maybe the Holy Spirit is with him and emboldening him. Maybe he's just been encouraged by the fact he's still alive. Renounce your sins by doing what is right. Saying to the king who thinks so much of himself, renounce your sins. And your wickedness by being kind to the oppressed. So that maybe then your prosperity will continue. There is hope here. And so as the curtain closes on scene 3 and we're about to go on to scene 4 as the people rush out onto the stage to bring away the bits of scenery and bring in the new bits. The verdict for Nebuchadnezzar is that the king who thought of himself in godlike proportions, being cosmic, reaching to the skies, who built a statue of himself to be worshipped, is going to be made like a beast.
Thanks, Chris. Okay, so we've seen the declaration of the king that began chapter 4. We've seen this dream he's had, which has troubled him, made him fearful. Dream of a man, a tree, which also seems to represent a man that's cut down. And Daniel says, dramatic, isn't it? Verse 22, you, O king, are that tree. Wow, what courage to have said that to him. What happens next? Should we read the last section of this powerful chapter? If you've got a Bible in front of you, we're in verse 28 of Daniel chapter 4. Let's read 28 and 29 and 30. All this happens to King Nebuchadnezzar. 12 months later, as the king was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon, he said, is not this the great Babylon I have built as the royal residence by my mighty power and the glory of my majesty? Oh, Nebuchadnezzar, don't do it. Don't go there. Verse 29 said 12 months later. So the events happen a year after the dream. It's quite a long time. I think you see something of the grace and the gentleness of God there. God gives Nebuchadnezzar a dream, clear warning. He gives him a Daniel to warn him. He then gives him a year to repent and change his ways. He's got ample time to avoid what's coming. At some point during this year, he's rejected this warning. He's either consciously rejected it, or simply the contentment at what he had built up has meant that it's just washed away and he's gradually forgotten. Verse 29, verse 30 tell us that God was really provoked into carrying out what he had warned. Whilst walking on the roof of the palace. If you just jump back to verse 4 of chapter 4, I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at home in my palace, contented and prosperous. Compare that with verse 29, I was walking on the roof of my palace. He's like looking at all he's built, and he says he's built it by my mighty power and my glory. He's back to his supreme arrogance. And in that little verse, verse 30, you get a definition of pride. By me and for me. By my power, for my glory. John Piper calls that the slogan of the proud. By my power, for my glory. Nebuchadnezzar has misunderstood, made a fatal error. He's misunderstood the source and he's misunderstood the goal. He thinks the source is him, by me. He thinks the goal is him, for me. We'd never do that, would we? We can do that, can't we? Our gifts, our achievements, our accomplishments in life, by me and for me. If there's any sign of fruitfulness and success in our lives, that is the grace of God on your life. If your kids are walking with the Lord today, that is the grace of God. That's not to limit the importance of parenting, but if they're walking with it, that is the grace of God. If your business that you ran for all those years where you worked really hard and you used the gifts that you've given, if that went well, that is the grace of God that caused that. And we are as foolish as Nebuchadnezzar if we think that it was by me and for me. Verse 31, the words were still on his lips. Yeah. When a voice came from heaven, like his voice mixed with the voice of God. This is what is decreed for you, King Nebuchadnezzar. Your royal authority has been taken from you. You will be driven away from the people and will live with the wild animals. You'll eat grass like cattle. 7 times will pass by for you until you acknowledge that the Most High is sovereign over the kingdoms of men and gives them to anyone he wishes. Immediately, what had been said about Nebuchadnezzar was fulfilled. He was driven away from people and ate grass like cattle. His body was drenched with the dew of heaven until his hair grew like the feathers of an eagle and his nails like the claws of a bird. You see the swiftness with which God acts. He's given a dream, he's given Daniel, he'd given a year, but when that slogan of pride comes out of Nebuchadnezzar's lips, God acts quickly. And it's pretty brutal. And there are other sources outside the Bible which speak of a serious illness, mental illness that Nebuchadnezzar suffered from at the end of his reign. Verse 31, the end of verse 31 says, your royal authority has been taken away from you. What did Daniel pray in chapter 2, verse 21? That beautiful psalm which ends that section, chapter 2, verse 21. God changes times and seasons. He sets up kings and deposes them. Nebuchadnezzar's in the middle of admiring. He's literally on the palace. He's in the middle of admiring all those things that Chris has just told us. The hanging gardens of Babylon, this extraordinary wall. He's looking out on there, and in an instant, it's taken away. Over Christmas, Anna and I spent some time in Brussels, visiting family and friends. And we spent some time with some good friends of ours who are Syrian. Excuse me. And these good friends of ours used to live in Syria until about 12, 13 years ago. They were from a significant family in the sea. In the middle of the night, knock at the door, they need to get out of the city. They've got to get out of Syria. Your name is on Bashir al-Assad's list. You need to get out. Middle of the night, they took their baby, who became one of our boys' best friends. Middle of the night, grab the little baby, flee the city, get out of Syria. They ran, they got to Turkey, eventually were able to come and live in Brussels and start a new life. We sat with them over Christmas, and they were saying of the joy of seeing Assad fall. A dictator not so different from Nebuchadnezzar up until now, who in an instant had to flee. And here we have Nebuchadnezzar in a desperate and pathetic state. Think of Saddam Hussein, that famous last picture we have of him in a hole in the ground, hiding. Nebuchadnezzar is here in a pathetic state. Superman has become a madman. He who refused to honor, God's glory, now loses his own glory and actually even loses his own sanity. It's quite a change. But it's not the end of the story. Verse 34. Let's read to the end of the chapter. At the end of that time, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes towards heaven. Good decision. And my sanity was restored. Then I praised the Most High. I honored and glorified him who lives forever. His dominion is an eternal dominion. His kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the peoples of the earth are regarded as nothing. He does as he pleases with the powers of heaven and the peoples of the earth. No one can hold back his hand and say to him, "What have you done?" At the same time that my sanity was restored, my honor and splendor were returned to me for the glory of my kingdom. My advisors and nobles sought me out, and I was restored to my throne and became even greater than before. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and exalt and glorify the King of heaven, because everything he does is right and all his ways are just. And those who walk in pride, brackets like me, he is able to humble. And those powerful words, the verse 34, a simple but profound statement as Nebuchadnezzar picks up the pen again. It switches to being the first person again. He said, I raised my eyes towards heaven. Finally, he looks heavenwards. At the beginning of this section, he's looking out at his great empire, looking at all his accomplishments. Now, he raises his eyes heavenwards. He's learned a lesson and is restored to health and to his throne. It says in verse 34, I praised the Most High, honored and glorified him who lived forever. All he'd previously done was worry about his own glory. By my power, for my glory. Now he understands it's about his glory. His dominion is an eternal dominion, unlike his own. His kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the peoples of the earth are regarded as nothing, even me, Nebuchadnezzar. He does as he pleases with the powers of heaven. If anybody else did as they pleased, that's a disaster. If any of us just lived our life doing as we pleases, that's a disaster. The only person who's allowed to do as they please, and it's a good thing, is God. And Nebuchadnezzar finally sees that. He does as he pleases with the powers of heaven and the peoples of the earth. No one can hold back his hand or say to him, what have you done? You ever ask that to God? No one can hold back his hand. Do you remember the two hands, those of us who are here, that we talked about in chapter 1? We said that there was the hand of history, like the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, but there was a dominant hand of God, Yahweh. Like we all have dominant hands, we're either right-handed or left-handed. One is stronger than the other. We said that Nebuchadnezzar was active, like my left hand, but God of heaven was more active, was more powerful, overrides the first one. Here, Nebuchadnezzar says, oh, nothing can hold back his hand. I do have some power, but I understand there's a much more dominant hand in history. And nothing can stop his hand. Did you notice the change of pronouns? Verse 30, that we read earlier, I have built, it's my power, my glory, my majesty. 34, 35, it's his kingdom, his dominion. He does as he pleases. That ultimately that's what it is to become a Christian. You go from me to he. If you're thinking, I'm kind of interested in faith, I'm interested in what it means to be, that's what it means to become a Christian. You stop living for me and you start living for he. And if you're in the room this morning and that is just like, you haven't quite made that transition, we'd really urge you to, believe it or not, follow the example of Nebuchadnezzar and go from me to he. Remember, this is the most powerful man in the world writing this text at the moment. At the same time, verse 36, my sanity was restored, my honor and splendor were returned to me. Everything comes back. Honor and splendor were returned to me. Any English teachers in the room? It's the passive tense, yeah? Like, they were taken from me, they were returned. I don't actually have any control, he's saying. It's interesting, each of the 3 chapters so far end with Nebuchadnezzar making a decision or even a law. End of chapter 1, he makes a decision to admit Daniel and his friends into the court. It's like he's active, he's in control. Chapter 2 ends with him rewarding Daniel and appointing him and his friends as important officials in the kingdom. Chapter 3 ends with him promoting the 3 friends and passing a law that everyone, you can't criticize their God. This chapter 4, there's no more laws. There's no more rules. It just ends with Nebuchadnezzar exulting and worshiping God, admitting his pride, admitting the greatness and supremacy of God. We often talk about, famous people's last words. These are the last recorded words. Presumably they weren't his last words, but the last recorded words of Nebuchadnezzar. Verse 37 are quite a thing for your last recorded words. I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and exalt and glorify the King of heaven, because everything he does is right, and all his ways are just. What a thing to say after 7 years of insanity. And God was at the heart of that insanity. And he says, everything he does is right. Everything he does is just. All those who walk in pride, he is able to humble. There's something deeply ironic. The final word we have recorded of Nebuchadnezzar is the word humble. Think of the verse that appears in Proverbs and then twice in the New Testament. God opposes the proud but gives grace to the humble. We've witnessed quite a journey, haven't we, from Nebuchadnezzar. From arrogant despot making all sorts of rules and laws to one confessing the supremacy of God and acknowledging his own pride. Apologies, there's not a whole bunch of jokes and funny stories this morning. I wouldn't say this is my favorite chapter of the Bible, but I would say it's one of those chapters which has impacted me the most. In my 20s and 30s, I must say this chapter, I've read it so many times. I found it a deeply impacting story. And as a young man, which I'm no longer so much, I found it a deeply impacting story. Moving from me to he. About submitting plans and hopes and dreams to God. Just as we finish our time this morning, there's kind of 2 options you have when you read this chapter. Either you say, well, I'm glad I'm not Nebuchadnezzar. Flippin' heck. What a guy. Or you say, I can be a little bit like Nebuchadnezzar. There's something of that spirit in me. There's something of that spirit of living for me rather than he in me. Nebuchadnezzar suffers from the disease of pride. And do you know what? That person sitting next to you right now, they suffer from the same disease. Can you believe it? The person sitting behind you suffers from it as well. And you do. And we do. All of us. C.S. Lewis calls pride a spiritual cancer. And like any other cancer, we need to do everything we can to get rid of it. The question, as I've said before, isn't, am I proud or am I humble? That's just not the question to ask. Am I proud? No, of course I'm not. I'm proud to report I'm not proud. You can't do that. Of course we're not. The question isn't, am I proud or am I not? We're all proud people. So we are. We've entitled today's talk deliberately, The Paths of Pride and Humility. Rather than say, am I proud, am I not? No, we know the answer to that question. The question is, am I a proud person on a path of pride upon which you find ruin and destruction and arguments? Or am I a proud person on the path of humility, on which you find servanthood and grace and generosity and kindness? It's like we're on one of those two paths. That's the question to ask ourselves this morning. How many of us need to raise our eyes towards heaven rather than surveying what's in front of us? That's why prayer is so important, isn't it? It's why worship is so important. Prayer keeps us on that path of humility. Because otherwise we start thinking it's by us and for us. That's why prayer and worship is just central to our lives. That's why Sunday gatherings isn't just a tradition, it's like a traditional thing to do. It's essential because you get yourself back on the path of humility. You recenter yourselves. You worship, you pray, it's not by me and for me. It's not dependent on me or for me. If there's any bitterness in any of our hearts, it might be because of pride. If there's any relational tension around us in our lives, it might be because of pride in us, the other person. If there's insecurity in our hearts, not quite sure who we are, what God's made us, got to prove ourselves, the root is probably pride. True freedom that we sung about this morning is only possible through humility. It's not actually possible if we're on a path of pride. Casting down our crowns that we've talked about earlier, that's picture language for going from me to he. It's picture language for making sure we get on the right path, the path of humility. It's picture language for rejecting that slogan of the proud. By my power, for my glory. That is the story of King Nebuchadnezzar. Quite a journey he goes on, and I think quite a lesson for me, for all of us. I would urge all of us to learn from him. Like one of the wisest things to do is we learn from others' mistakes, don't we? Let's learn from him. Let's not let God put us through anything remotely like that in order to bring us to a place of humility. Annie, would you be happy to come and lead us in a final song together? Let's make humility a high, high value in the life of our church. Let's choose to walk humbly with one another. Let's choose to keep short accounts with each other, to think the best of one another, to serve one another. We're going to finish with a final song, and it's going to help us just make that conscious decision again. Lord, I live for he, not me. If you know Jesus and you've lived for many years, the problem is we still revert back to living for me, don't we? It's like human nature. And we again and again need to reorient ourselves and say, no, I live for you, God. I join with Nebuchadnezzar and say, you're the most high one, and I want to live for you. I want us just to sing and to worship, set our hearts on him as we finish our morning, but it's also a moment for repentance. I know that's not a word we always like to use, but it just might be a moment for some of us where we just need to say, Lord, I am sorry. I am sorry where pride has taken root in my heart. I want to see it like that cancer and just get rid of it. I want to receive your grace, receive your forgiveness afresh this morning. In a couple of chapters' time, we're going to meet Jesus, chapter 7. He's the cornerstone of our faith. He's the one who forgives us. He's the humble one who took that path of humility before us. He's the one who extends grace and forgiveness if we need it afresh this morning. Shall we stand together? Let's sing, let's worship, let's bring our hearts before him, still our hearts if necessary before him. Ask for forgiveness if necessary. Submit ourselves afresh to the wonderful lordship of God.